well, to try to place your questions in the context of the challenges, because this is about challenges and reforms. So the ministers were demographic challenge, equality challenge, the challenge of the curriculum, challenge of planning, technology, the economic challenge, and the international challenge. So if you just could, in asking a question, maybe mention the challenge you think it's most relevant to. And perhaps I'll just begin by asking Kathleen, in her very stimulating talk on which centred on equality, said we hadn't heard from the travellers here today, or anybody from the. And I know there is a young woman here from Pavy Point who told me that she might like to ask a question. So would you like to start? Yes. There, to the right.
I suppose, keeping in line with learning from today, I thought one of the really interesting things that stood out all day was that all of the Nordic countries could really clearly talk about the principles that underpin their education system. And I thought to myself, well, what are the principles that underpin our education system? If I had to do a seminar abroad and talk about what underpins our education system, I'd have to grab things from different policies and different strategies. And so we don't actually have those pillars to reflect on. And I think that reflects a lot on society, because one of the things that came through very strongly, in my opinion, was the emphasis on equality and the absolute acceptance by all speakers that this was completely normal, that equality should be a priority for education systems, that society itself would accept it as a priority. And I think that's something that's severely lacking in our own system at the moment, both within the education system but also within broader society, that commitment to equality. One of the things I'd just like to ask the panel, just in terms of their own experiences, would be with the commitment to equality. A lot of you spoke a little bit about kind of at policy level what had been done around that, but I'd be interested in how the principle of equality has been reinforced kind of and underpinned both in initial teacher education and in continuous professional development. And then secondly, following on from that, just given my own background working with a minority group that has a very high dropout rate from upper level secondary education, and which there has been absolutely no negligible progress, and any provisions that were there to change that have since been cut. I'd be really interested in hearing about initiatives that have been introduced to challenge groups that have been identified as at risk of early dropout. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Who would like to take?
About 3.5 years ago, by the opposition spokesperson for the Labour Party on education. For those people who aren't aware, Tuam is in the west of Ireland. It's a diocesan capital, but probably has the highest number of settled travellers in the country. There was a principal from the primary school that kind of dominated the front part of the row of the discussion. I'm telling the story to illustrate where I think we need to go. And he was talking about very high levels of travellers leaving his school and the need for retaining the support systems that were there. And I asked him how many of his pupils, when they went to secondary school from age 12 up to 18, or even up to the compulsory end of it, up to 16, how many of them stayed on in education? His reply was, that's not my concern. I'm only responsible for primary education, and where they go and what happens to them after that is of no concern to me. I think what we have to, we are facing reductions in inputs in terms of contributions to that. We have to start developing a culture of measuring the outcomes in every aspect. And not in an aggressive way, but just out of natural curiosity. I mean, if you're making a dish at home, if you're cooking something, you're constantly testing it to see if the flavour is what you're trying to get. And maybe Kathleen or somebody else might want to ask questions about why in the research world of education, in the third level sector, why measuring outcomes in a manner that actually informs policy making doesn't come about more readily.
Kathleen, would you like to?
Well, I'd like to give the answer to that, because I have written research proposals along with the Professor of Statistics in the university and Professor of Education, I think on 3 different occasions that we submitted to the Department of Education and Science, proposing that we do exactly as you say, that we would actually, but we would need to have something which I think there are a lot of vested interests in Ireland when it comes to social change. And I think professional groups sometimes think they're devoid of vested interests, and I include academics among them, mind you. But I know that there was staunch opposition to that, because if we had data, which we should have, and I can see, you have all the data from Sweden, and you can tell every year, we don't have that data by social class every year, we simply don't have it, because we don't collect it in school. And with the PPS numbers and protections for privacy, we could easily collect that data. We could collect it by gender, by traveller identity, by disability, by the 9 equality grounds, and by social class. I can't remember how often we have written proposals, we've sought funding, and we've got nowhere. So I'm only saying there is absolutely a desire to do it on behalf of those of us who are concerned, but we have never been permitted, because we have to, the data needs to be there. People don't realise in Ireland that public examination data is not publicly accessible, and it's not disaggregated by social class background and all that, because we need to have one measure. I've always argued this in relation to higher education. We had the Clancy reports, and now we've nothing. In fact, we've moved backwards in the last 6 or 7 years. We have less information now on a national basis annually than we had at higher education than we had 10 years ago. So I do think there needs to be cooperation from all departments if that's to happen. And certainly the other thing I have to say is there has been the Irish Research Council, on which I served, I might add, for a small period of time. At the education branch, if you like, of that, there was virtually no funding for research in education. None. No one is interested, and I think that that reflects what I call the carelessness and indifference of the professional classes. I am very exercised about it, because I think there are huge disparities and huge inequalities, and those who are insiders in education, as we wrote about in the math study, the insiders know well how the system works, and they don't care, and they don't want it to change. And that's what I think that people forget. Even in Norway there, as you spoke, I thought was very interesting. I think you need to look as well on all countries at the rising inequality that has occurred in the area of neoliberalism, because that has happened all over Europe. And as you have rising inequality, people will advantage their own children if they're allowed to do so, which is effectively what you were saying about Norway. And that is happening right before our eyes. There isn't just a pressure from below. People forget there's a pressure downwards from people who are already privileged in a fear of losing privilege. And the more inequality of society you have, the more fear you have. Fear is a very powerful mobilizer. But to answer the Minister's question, we have had nowhere to apply for funding, or when we applied, we didn't get it, and that was the truth. The market, that you have a market whereby you have a right to good education. And maybe that's the important issue. Not, as somebody said to me, I want to go to a decent hospital. I don't particularly want to have a choice of hospitals. So I think that really is the issue. We need to watch what we're concerned about here, because we know from research that anything, they talk about a bright flight, white flight, people refer to it, where people move out and they move their children. And of course, people will advantage their own children. I'm saying the more unequal your society becomes, the more you will see it polarised in education, because people become fearful and they will work to protect the interests of their own children. So I think one of the choice ideology is something that has to be called into question. That's what I'm saying. At that level, about in the class sense. Religious belief issue is a different issue, but I'm talking about class and stratification.
All right. I saw this.
Brandon Tagney, I'm from Trinity College in Dublin, and I think I'm addressing them all.
That's happening.
I'm in danger of getting seriously depressed here. We were charged with coming up with positive solutions and seeing what we can do to bring our education system forward. Now we're being faced with this task of we have to change the entire complete value system of our society and of human beings. Right? I don't say this in a flippant sense, because I realise that educational change is part of a larger socio-economic change, and there's only so much we can do. So on a positive note, what I'd like to do is ask any of our North representatives if there's one thing, one bit of advice or one thing that we might work here, what would they offer us?
All addressed, I might as well start. I think that after the crisis in 2008, Icelanders also needed to review their values from scratch. The method that we used was to go to the grassroots. So we had what we called a national meeting, where people were drawn from the national registry, 1,200 people came together and reassessed and revisited what should be our values to guide us into the next 100 years or so. This led to the creation, using the same method, of a new draft constitution. We have used this method of national meetings to discuss certain topics. Education is one of them, where we have drawn. We call them now hosted meetings. So we have identified challenges first, and then used the pool in the grassroots to come up with potential solutions. We've also used this in the field of vocational training. By this, we have gathered loads and loads of information that we are, if I may say, trying to get our head around in implementing. So we're not there yet, but we have at least started. So this is what I would
like to pick up on the remark that we don't want a wide choice of hospitals, we don't want a decent hospital. I think from the Nordic tradition comes that most people will actually want to put their child into the local school. Because that's a place where they will meet the kids from the neighborhood. That everybody recognizes that's the best thing to do. So one piece of advice: make sure that the local school is so good that you don't want to put your child into a car and drive there a number of miles.
Right, and
I guess this is a bit more dangerous area to try to come up with good ideas, but at least I could tell you just a little bit about some experiments that are going on right now. And I don't know, we don't have the results, so I don't know how successful they will be, but I think that they are interesting. There's a number of experiments going on in lower secondary education, trying to develop different sort of line of contents so that you can have a mild degree of specialization. So you try to find out how you can motivate all group of students in lower secondary. So you can have classes specializing in using information technology in all subjects. You can have much more foreign language in another line. You can be working on creativity, how to create something with your hands and using all the subjects in that. And there's a number of different experiments going on. And at least it seems as if students become much more motivated. Whether they learn more is still to be proven. Then I would like to come up with another thing. It's not an easy solution because it takes more resources. But I think that we have some evidence around that students coming from deprived areas, they are more dependent on the number of hours of instruction than other students are. So, but of course the implication of that is that you need to have more differentiated schools where the number of hours of teaching will have to differ. We have some experiments right now going on in Denmark where schools are open from 8 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so they have more hours. We have that particularly in areas where we have many minority students, but we also have it in areas where we have many students coming from Danish homes where the parents have very little education. We haven't seen the results yet, but there are some evidence also, in particular from North America, that there is a positive effect of having more hours for students coming from deprived areas. So that there might be something that one should think about, differentiating the amount of resources, the amount of hours of teaching between different areas in the society.
I would like to add to what Jonas said here, that I think it's very interesting that when we're listening to experience from all these different countries, I think everyone has mentioned that they are focusing more on trying to equip the teachers with more evidence-based pedagogical methods. And also in Sweden we are we are allocating more resources now to make systematic reviews of what works and what doesn't work, and so that it could be used so our teachers could use those methods. And also we have been reluctant to make randomized control trials in Sweden, but actually now we have started up some of those. It's a very complicated trials, but there are a lot of experience going on, and I think we're investing more in research, and I'm very happy to hear that it seems to be the same development in many countries.
Thank you. We have to hear from Finland on this.
I'd like to say something.
Okay.
We have been now engaging in discussions and actions in which school buildings are being used 24 hours a day. So schools could be used for different types of activities as a resource, as a hub for learning, for lifelong learning, life-wide learning. So while I'm listening to your expressions about this, that extending the school day, perhaps there could be another conceptualization of this, that extending the activities that go on the school for different types of learners and also for learners of all ages. So libraries, other activities, and designing the school spaces in such a way that they can be easily used for different types of purposes. This is also to do with economics, because then the schools would not be closed after 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, but there would be all sorts of other activities happening. So there may be the future, and that is what we are now doing in Finland. Modern schools that are being built are now designed in such a way that it facilitates different types of activities. So education is one, school-based, but then there is this non-formal and informal educational learning made possible in these premises.
Decided to come in because of the previous questioner who was pessimistic. I have to say, I'm as a result of today, I'm very optimistic because I found there was a whole range of new ideas that we won't necessarily be able to translate directly into the Irish experience because of historical reasons and economic reasons and so on. But nevertheless, there are elements there which we can look at and hope to learn from and perhaps put our own shape on. I think this whole idea of the ecology of education, I think, is extremely important. I mean, this whole notion of making education as sort of part and parcel of our sort of environment. You know, that it's not just something you go to for a few years and then you leave and then you have a different life, and that we are all part of it. I think that's extremely important. I do believe that Irish values are changing. It's not very clear what we're going to become. I do think there's a debate, we need to have a serious debate about what it is we want to become. Perhaps the Constitutional Commission will help to identify that. But we do have a hybrid system here in Ireland at the moment. I mean, historically, services like education were delivered on the basis of charity, apart from the national school system. And I think we are moving from that in all kinds of ways. And I think the key point that Professor Kathleen Lynch made was, you know, we have to base it on economic equality. Otherwise, we won't get the kind of outcomes that they have in the Nordic countries. And I do believe seriously that, I mean, what struck me, for instance, from the Icelandic presentation, they have 6 pillars. I would ask the Minister to, if I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything, I want to thank you for coming here and thank you for staying for the afternoon. Because too often we have the ministers who are right somewhere, speak for 10 minutes and they're gone. So I really appreciate you staying. But you outlined the 7 challenges. What are the 7 pillars of Irish education? Because I think the 7 pillars, whatever, or 5 or 6, whatever they may be, must inform the challenges and how we address the challenge.
Just in case it gets lost in the conversation, some of the things that Kathleen Lynch was saying, and some of the things that someone else said up there from one of the Nordic countries about white flight or bright flight, and about how most parents want to send their children to the local school, and what we have to be ensure is that the local school is actually a good school, the best school. It's just one small experience in my own past. I brought up a number of students from Cork to Belfast 2 years ago to look at community projects in Belfast and look at services in Belfast. And I brought them to a place called Twinbrook, which in West Belfast, which would have one of the highest levels of socioeconomic deprivation in the north. And I brought them to a nursery school in Twinbrook. And in the nursery school was very well equipped, but not only was it well equipped, but not only was it there for parents and kids from that poor area, shall we say, but there were parents from middle class areas outside Povlas bringing their children into the working class area, because they recognised that the provision in relation to nursery education was superior to what they would get outside the working class area. So it seems to me that one way in which we can at least try to tackle inequalities in the society is to make sure that the education resources in working class areas are at least equivalent to, if not superior to, those in rich areas.
My name is Margaret E. Ward, and I'm a business owner, a journalist, and a writing skills trainer, and I would just like to ask some of the speakers here about the importance of critical thinking in an educational system, and also the teaching of civics and civic responsibility.
Thank you, and I'll take a third question. The lady.
I'm Sumi Cook from NUI Galway. I have a kind of reflection question for the whole panel. I think we've had a very rich range of knowledge and evidence from a range of countries, and also we've had a very useful talk from the Minister talking about the challenges. And I suppose my question is about the consensus on how to address the challenges, which has seemed to be around the reform of teacher education. And I'd just like to invite some reflections, critical reflections if you like, on where there may be less consensus, because there do seem to be some variations. And I think there was Noel Ward earlier this morning who talked about education in Ireland being at a philosophical crossroads. So the challenge is the challenge of the philosophical crossroads, and what informs teacher education. It seemed to me from the range of contributions all day today that there have been two slightly differing versions of improving teacher professionalism. One which is more centrally planned, it's about quality control, it's about monitoring and evaluation, and the other is more about teacher autonomy. So there seem to be two different versions of professionalism, and perhaps they are complementary, or perhaps they are a bit different. And I thought I'd like to reflect some reflections.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, critical thinking is part of the 21st century competencies and skills, and definitely it needs to be, and we try our best to integrate this important skill and learning of this skill throughout the curriculum. In today's world, there is so much information available, and everybody can produce this information. So critical thinking is so pivotal, so essential that we cannot, none of us or our future generations can live without it. So, but we must also remember when we study the outcomes of the education that we also try to measure it. Because we seem to forget that it is because it is so important that we should also see whether we have been successful in creating individuals who are critical thinkers and who are able to also ask questions, not only answer questions. And then we in Finland about engaging and civic activities and engagement. We have in our curriculum periods in which particularly secondary school students go out and do their service in different fields, do their work placements, practices, and do their own projects and reflect these learnings back at school. So that is one example. But of course, teachers are free to create their teaching, and so perhaps these activities are used also when teaching and learning other disciplines at the same time. Ideally, that should be the case.
All right, Christina.
It's very important that you have critical thinking, but you can't teach critical thinking literally. I mean, there are a number of points I've made. Irish education tends to be very atheoretical and anti-intellectual. I think that's true. For example, if you study history at second level, you tend to study one theory. If you study economics, you learn classical economics. That's even true in much higher education. You need to learn that there are different frameworks for seeing the world, different models. That's a very basic academic point. And I think if you want children or young people to think critically, it starts when they're young. And the democracy that you spoke about, which is, I'm familiar with all the research and all, that is much more. Schools are democratic institutions. You learn to enter dialogue. No one has mentioned Paulo Freire's phenomenal work, intellectually and philosophically, on the notion of dialogical learning as a way of making people think critically. You enter into dialogue with people with whom you teach, and they come to know the world critically. You do not engage in banking education. I think we need to radically look at what we could define as critical thinking. It isn't something you can teach literally. It's how you relate to somebody. Getting rid of your title. I always say to students, do never use my title. If I am a good teacher, I can have dialogue with you and my name is Kathleen. You do not have to call me by a professional name. I think it's a whole new democratic relationship that we need to establish if we teach children the importance of their voice and how to learn. So that would require a radical philosophical shift in this country. A radical philosophical shift in education. So I think the point that was made, what are our core values? Well, I think if we want, new creativity, we need to get away from what I think is not as bad as in France and Germany, where I have studied. It's not as much more authoritarian in those countries. Education is authoritarian. But I still think we are fairly well near the authoritarian end of it ourselves. Our uniforms reflect it. The idea of the military metaphor, that's what it comes from. That's what uniforms signify, the original foundations of education. Going back, if you read Foucault or any of the people who write about it, that was the idea of regulation and control. So I think we need a very different culture to create that kind of critical thinking, both in the practice of how we teach, how we relate to people, how we name them, how we talk to them, and then the kind of different theories and different models. And I would make a plea as well, which we don't have in this country. If we want young people at second level to understand technology, science, to know where they are in the world socially, they need to study social scientific subjects. We don't have any in this country at second level. We have no sociology. How can we study the media? The media controls public opinion in this country. 60% of it is owned by one independent newspapers and media. Most people don't even know that the news is not the news. The news is, as it's constructed by somebody in RTE. So I'm only saying, those are very, I just think if you want this new world, we need to go back to grassroots.
All right. Okay, and thanks, Kathleen.
It was about the question of quality control. That what I was reflecting on this morning was that question about teaching quality and how you measure teaching quality. And I was critical, and I spoke actually to the chief inspector about it at one of the breaks. Of a type of model that is a supervisory model that implies a distrust of people at classroom level and so on, and how that is, maybe damaging to a person's professional self-regard and so on. But that's not to close one's eyes to the need for accountability. I mean, accountability is an important and necessary thing. Teachers have to be accountable and should be accountable. And I'm not pleading for some form of teacher autonomy and just a kind of a laissez-faire for teachers. But what I was pleading for was a different kind of a model of accountability, a less of a top-down model, a more engaged, a more participative, collaborative type of model. Trying to learn from Finland to some extent, because one of the things that the Finnish system seemed to us to do was to move right away from a central inspection model. And one, just allied to that, I was particularly intrigued, and it's going up in a different direction, I don't want, but just in one sentence, intrigued by the debate about the local level versus the centralised. That one of the reasons we do that in Ireland, I think, is we have a very centralised model, and whether we have any opportunity here to become more decentralised in terms of education debate and provision, but that then was mentioned, I think it was, in Denmark as being a potential problem that they felt was getting in the way of reform, which is getting to open a different debate.
Yeah. To open another can. Minister.
Just very quick, the question that Panchia's put to me, and to expand a little bit more. The National Council for Curriculum and Assessment have published proposals for the reform of the junior cycle. And we're now in the final stages in the department of responding to their recommendations. And they set out a number of pillar values, if you like, the kind of what's going on at the moment. There seems to be consensus between the Nordic countries and Ireland and other international research, and that is the quality of the teacher. Good teachers produce good results. And the change that we've now moved here in the National Literacy and Numeracy Strategy and in the recently announced reconfiguration of the teacher training colleges configuration in education is that the 3-year course will go to a 4-year course for a primary school teacher, and the extra time will be devoted to pedagogic skills, including the ability to research the outcome of your inputs in a way that we've taken from the Nordic example. At second level, where the secondary school teacher was called the H-dip for those people who are familiar with it here, was very much a lucky dip in terms of the experience that people had. And that's going to a 2-year course, and it'll be much more structured and be much more analysed. But you know, the harvest of that reform won't be seen in terms of the outcomes for a minimum of 5 years before those teachers start to get into the classroom, and their subsequent harvest in terms of how they affect their pupils is another 5, 6, 7 years. But you know, if you have to start somewhere, and the people who reformed the primary school curriculum back, I think, in 1970, 71, have left us with a wonderful legacy that has been built upon slowly and surely over time and is reviewed. The other change really that I would say is that the reforms that Kathleen was talking about, changing the philosophy in terms of what we have in our school system, we already have that alternative model in Educate Together. The relationship between students in primary schools is on a first name basis with the teachers. They don't have uniforms. They're the only component school that is in that space. And now they're recognised at second level and will be produced in post-primary schools. And we might see if that changes there. But that's certainly, in response to what Kathleen was saying, there is a change coming within the second level system between the curriculum reform and the increased choice in the kind of colleges and schools that are available.
Thank you, Minister. There's just, I'm sorry, one last question, and that gentleman there has been valiantly trying to get through for some.
I'd love to thank TASC for putting on a terrific day. And I was very I'm reminded of the caveat that was entered right at the start of the day, which was we should engage in policy learning, not policy borrowing. And for me, one of the defining moments of the day was when the two initial speakers were asked to set out the fundamental values. And Noel, I think, very honestly said, in Ireland, we value education. And by that I took him to mean schooling and certification and credentialism and so on. And Anders then said, have a look at the opening statement of this legislation in Denmark. And this focus is on learning. And then, of course, as you expanded, we saw learning is focused on citizenship, on learning to live in a democratic society, and on that lovely point you make about how authority is exercised. And then at the end of your presentation, you said one of the dilemmas, one of the issues, and it seems to me follows naturally from a consideration of learning for the 21st century, is the kind of restricted nature of the traditional subjects. And you said interdisciplinarity. And of course, I recall, and some people in the room would be aware, that there's a wonderful, eloquent and elegant aspirational paragraph in the guidelines for transition year on interdisciplinary learning. And of course, what we know from the research is that that's one of the areas in transition year where schools spectacularly fail, because teachers tend to be very much down in their own subject areas. And feeling a little bit low on that, in our experience, I was greatly lifted by Christina's so many remarks she made about where Finland is and where the future is. Seems to me we already have that in different ways, in the transition year project. We have it in terms of reaching out into the community. We have it in terms of the avoidance of streaming, in so many different ways. For me, one of the lessons of today is the kind of contested nature of what I see in schools, where transition year is continually in danger of being colonised by leaving cert values. So also what we hear today is this pragmatism that we're coming from, and our pragmatic view of schooling and the credentialism, and what Kathleen has been talking about people's interest to gain advantage, and that much broader, richer view you're suggesting from the Nordic countries about what we understand by learning. And I absolutely agree with the Minister's emphasis on a totally reformed junior cycle. So thank you, Kath.
And now, there were really a lot of areas covered relating to equality, the need for information, cooperation, joined up departmental thinking, funding for research and education, the question of the education of gifted people, of elites, the 8th challenge to be considered, the arts and creativity. We looked at parents' involvement in children's education and their rights or not, as the case may be, and a suggestion that we need to unpack the notion of choice. People asked for advice from the panel, and we heard things like get ideas from the grassroots, local schools, may have good local schools, experiment a bit, it increases motivation, that there should be longer hours of instruction for more deprived students, perhaps, to review things constantly, what works and what doesn't, and to design and use school buildings 24 hours a day for all types of activities and ages. It's good we're having this in Croke Park. Other people, well, Irish people will understand that reference. Then there was the concept of an ecology of education and the implications of that concept. Somebody asked for pillars as well as challenges. There was allusion to the resource issues. We were asked about critical thinking and a response given which related to a degree of anti-intellectualism in Ireland, and questions about teacher education. Personally, I'd like to thank very much all the speakers, and particularly the Nordic speakers. And I'm sure you'd all join with me in that.